Hi, folks. My name is Will Gries, and I'm a product manager on the Azure Files team. And I'm joined by my colleague Vincent today to talk about how we're simplifying Azure Files with the Provision v2 and the Microsoft.FileShares management model. So let's dive right into talking about the Provision v2 model. So the Provision v2 model is our new pricing model for Azure Files that is a dramatic simplification over our existing pay-as-you-go model and a simplification over our Provision v1 model. So the way that we've done this is by pairing the flexibility of the pay-as-you-go model with the deterministic cost of the provision model. So when you provision a share, you provision storage, IOPS, and throughput. By default, we are recommending a certain amount of IOPS and a certain amount of throughput to you based on the type of share you have. For example, if you have an SSD file share or an HDD file share. However, if you know more about what your requirements are, you can provision actually more or less than this limit. So what this gives you is the ability to create a file share that is tuned exactly to whatever you need it for, but still has a predictable cost. So I want to talk about a few aspects of this model. So one of the things to think about here is that when you're creating a provisioned file share, you need to have some buffer on whatever you're going to use. So the reason is because a file share that's 100% full on storage is essentially read-only, right? It's exactly like if you had your hard disk in your computer and you just filled it up to the maximum, you wouldn't continue to be able to write to your disk. Your disk has a fixed capacity. But, unlike your hard disk in your computer or your traditional file server on-prem, you would always be able to increase the file share size up to the file share maximum that we have for Provision v2. And the other thing I wanted to highlight here is that, a file share that's running at 100% of its IOPS or throughput capacity technically can work. You get all those IOPS, you can use them all, and they're, kind of ephemeral. So, if you use 100% in 1 second and then 0% in the next second, it's not like, because you used 100% last second, you can't use 100% next second, if that makes sense. Running at 100% of what you've provisioned is also a bit risky because if you go over that, whatever that provision line, then you'll be throttled. And there's a caveat there because we do support some bursting to make sure that the throttling experience doesn't happen and that customers have time to adjust. But in the event that they, run over and they've exhausted their burst ability, then they'll get throttled, which most customers will realize as increased latency on the share. So, in both cases, you're going to want to have some buffer over what you think you're going to use in the normal case. And like exactly what that buffer is up to you. But a reasonable rule to follow is to start the share at 50% full on storage and follow the IOPS and throughput recommendations. The reason I say this is because whatever you get in terms of IOPS and throughput is going to be more than sufficient for most use cases to get started. And then you can tune that IOPS upwards or downwards based on what you see in Azure Monitor. And then we would recommend that you increase your share size when you get to about 80% full. So I wanted to work through a cost example here. We have on the left of the screen kind of an example file share. I've gone and done this, 50% full rule. And so I said I have 10 terabytes. I want to provision 20. I actually don't know what my IOPS and throughput are. So I'm just going to accept the recommended IOPS and throughput. So for an HDD file share, if I just follow the recommendation, this is what I would be recommended. And then in total, I'm coming to about 3.3 cents per used gig. So I've essentially totaled it up and divided it by the number of gigs that I use. This, if you compare this to pay-as-you-go, this should be a lot cheaper than what most pay-as-you-go customers are using today. But the real magic comes in if you do know what your actual underlying requirements are. So in this example, what I've done is I said, hey, at peak, I'm using 1,000 IOPS and 100 MIB per second. So I'm going to follow that same 50% full rule, and then I'll price it out the same way. And what you see is the price has fallen to around 2.4 cents per used gig, almost a full cent per used gig step down. So in general, this should be quite a lot cheaper. And I think the key takeaway here is hopefully it's also quite a lot easier to price out and like do paper exercise before the deployments. So for the final point here, I have just a very similar mock-up of the SSD prices. So basically what I did in this example is I created a sort of a high, I think this was an example that we used in our blog post, SQL database or something that has not a super lot of storage, but needing a lot of IOPS and throughput. And so in this model, because the provision to be one model has those fixed ratios between storage and IOPS, you actually need to provision a lot more storage. And you can see here the number that I ended up provisioning for 2 terabytes of used capacity is around 14 terabytes. And that's because to get the IOPS and throughput that I want, I have to actually provision 14 terabytes. So as a result, you end up with a huge expense, right? $1.12 per used gig. That's very, very expensive storage. And I just want to sort of illustrate that when you move to the provision v2 model, if you do the exact same thing, you follow the recommendation, you end up with exactly the same amount of storage, IOPS, and throughput, you're getting a discount right away just from using provision v2 without changing any of your provisioning. And the reason for that is because we've dropped the price a little bit with provision v2. But then if you know, as we do in this case, that actually I don't need that much storage, I need a certain amount of IOPS and a certain amount of throughput, I can provision exactly what I need on all 3 dimensions. So then the price is dropped to around 38 cents per used gig. So with that, we've reached the end of the provision v2 content. I'd like to pass off the mic to my colleague Vincent.
Now we're going to switch topic to Microsoft.FileShares resource provider. This is a feature that's currently in preview with the goal to simplify the FileShare management experience. We're doing this by uplevel the FileShare object to be its own top-level Azure resource. On the chart on the right, you can see traditionally in order to use the classic FileShare, we first need to deploy a resource group and then a storage account, and then deploy the file shares within the storage account. Where the new file share experience allows us to create the file share right after we create the resource group, taking a step away from the creation experience. The file share resource is offered by the Microsoft.FileShares resource provider, where the classic file share is offered by the Microsoft.Storage resource provider. Another way to distinguish between the classic and the new file share experience is by the color of the icon. Blue represents the classic file share, where purple represents the new file share experience. Because the feature is currently still in preview, we only have support on NFS 4.1 protocol file shares and SSD tier. We do have vision to bring in support on SMB protocol and HDD tier in the near future. There are a couple other benefits other than taking away the storage account that I believe is worth mention about. So let's walk through them one by one. But first, let's take a quick look at the file share creation experience to understand the flow better. Here I have a resource group I created in advance. I'm going to go ahead and search file share in the marketplace and go ahead and create a brand new file share. There are 5 tabs in the creation flow, but in fact only the basic tab is mandatory and required. But for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to actually walk through all 5 tabs. Simply choose a file share name, and you will notice that the tier and protocol are graded out because we currently don't support HDD and SMB protocol. Choose your desired region, capacity, and redundancy. Since all new file shares are using the Provision v2 billing model, this gives us the flexibility to either use the recommended provisioning or manually specify the IOPS and throughput. On the Events tab, I can choose my root squash option for my NFS protocol file share. I can also use the mount name feature to set up a different mount name to mount the file share to the virtual machine. This could be helpful for those customers who want to follow a special naming convention. On the Networking tab, I can set up both the service and private endpoint. But for the sake of demonstration, I will disable the service endpoint and create a brand new private endpoint. I'll choose the same location as my virtual network that I created in advance. I'll give this private endpoint a name and choose file share for target sub-resource, and choose my virtual network that I created in advance. Choose default subnet and enable private DNS integration and click on Add. This will allow me to deploy a file share and have a brand new private endpoint deployed at the same time and ready to be used. The Tags tab is exactly the same as all other stored services. Last but not least, in the Review plus Create tab, I can take another look at the file share that I'm about to create. Everything looks good. I'm going to go ahead and start creating the file share. Once the file share is ready to go, we can go to the resource itself. On the Overview tab of the new file share, we can see some important information and properties about this file share. Everything looks good. I'm going to go ahead and connect the file share to a Linux virtual machine. You will notice that there's a brand new checkbox called Mount with Encryption in Transit. This is a brand new feature that we bring for NFS protocol file shares that adds another layer of security. Now let's switch back to talk about some of the key benefits the new file share experience provides. The first one is the granular control at the share level, where each share will now have its own network and security rules. The classic file share has some networking rules applied at the storage account level, and it also can include some irrelevant services like queues, tables, and blob services. On the right, the new file share experience have its own network and security rules, so you don't have to worry about finding irrelevant settings. And this also gives you the precise blast radius control and cleaner cost attribution to teams, apps, and customers. Another benefit is the predictable and flexible cost. All new file shares will be using the Provision v2 billing model, now that each share will stand on its own as a separate billable item. For classic file share, we simply will get a monthly bill on the storage account, and then we have to go in and manually do some calculation to figure out how much each share has cost. Where the new file share experience will simply tell you how much each share and each service cost. This could be very helpful for those customers who want to bill file shares to independent customer or department at the end of the month. All new file shares will also have its own dedicated performance, so we don't have to worry about noisy neighbors or resource contentions within the storage account. Each share gets its own IOPS throughput and capacity, making it ideal for environments managing hundreds of shares or for separating departments or customer workloads. We also use this time to increase the scale limits of the file share. So for control plane limits, on the classic file share, we can create up to 250 storage accounts, and if it's using the Provision v2 model, each storage account can create up to 50 classic file shares. For the new file share experience, in preview, we're supporting up to 1,000 file share per subscription per region, and we do have intention to increase this limit as we're getting closer to general availability. In the meantime, the management read, write, and list operations all have an improvement to maximum 375 requests per second with the refill speed at 37 requests per second. I do want to quickly highlight that because the feature is currently still in preview, there are some limitations. Features like customer managed keys, file share level soft delete, and AKS integration via the CSI driver are not supported at the moment. Again, SMB protocol and HDD tier will come shortly after. And lastly, we will continue to bring more region supports as we are working closer to the general availability. To learn more about Azure Files, Provision v2 model, and also Microsoft.FileShares resource provider, please use our links down below. And thank you so much for your time.